It has become rather fashionable these days to criticize the cohort known as boomers, and more scientifically known as baby boomers, especially by those in political discourse on both sides of the aisle who are trying to diagnose the present state of Western civilization. And depending on their specific ideological lens and biases, they will have different answers that come around to a kind of similar valence and conclusion about the so-called evils of baby boomers. This is what I would call anti-boomerism. But what if I told you that anti-boomerism, in more cases than not, is simply an excuse for current younger generations, like mine, like Gen Z, to not take responsibility for their actions and also for the world they live in? And what if I told you that anti-boomerism, more than just being mere resentment, as many of its critics will say it is, actually reflects deep underlying flaws in thinking that could be rectified by a simple, more smarter look at the facts of our current condition of our society today, that is not, built upon trying to look at the older generation as an enemy, but instead seeks to dispassionately understand the current condition of Western civilization. And what if I told you that there need not be an intergenerational fight here, but there could instead be a kind of reconciliation that allows both generations to understand each other and work towards a better kind of future? That is what I believe anti-boomerism misses. And in this video, we're going to actually evaluate anti-boomerism. We're going to look at its premises, its arguments, and I'm going to explain why it is an utterly dead end, and there is a better pathway forward when it comes to analyzing how the world got to where it is today over the past 50, 60 years. But before we address this, my friends, hope all of you are doing well. I'm Christian Wong. Thank you so much for being here. If you enjoy political and social commentary and cultural commentary from a philosophical bent, rooted in the ideas of natural law, the ideas of reason, the ideas of civil society and civic virtue, then I would encourage you, of course, to like, share, comment, subscribe, do whatever you can to ensure our message is successful. Even if you disagree with me, disagreement, my friends, is what allows civil society to exist, and it also allows us all to have a better quest for truth. So I do not shy away from disagreement or controversy, so long as it is fruitful and leads to edification and not sensationalism. Thank you guys so much. Now, please enjoy the video. So, before we explore this topic, we must, of course, define some terms. So when I say the word boomerism or baby boomers, I'm referring to the cohort that social scientists say were born between 1946 and 1964. So for scale, just for context, the oldest of the boomers were 18 in 1964, and the youngest were 18 in 1982. This fact is going to be very important when it comes to trying to assess the blame that is oftentimes laid upon boomers for the state of the world today. But we'll get to that in a second. We should also understand that the criticism, as I mentioned, comes from different places and takes different forms. And I'm going to assign some advocates to the anti-boomer position as well to help us understand it. Before I do that, it is generally important to understand the anatomy of anti-boomerism. So, anti-boomerism is a position that has several characteristics that are important to understand. The first characteristic, as you see on your screen here, is that there's a tendency to blame the world's current issues on the baby boomer generation. This takes different forms. You could see, for example, debates about homeownership. You could see people blaming the boomer generation for the fact that homeownership has become much harder for young people in their view. On the right, there is a kind of a blame for mass migration and cultural deterioration. A very real concern, by the way, that is being seen across Western countries like the United States and the United Kingdom. A lot of folks blame boomers on that. Others will blame more general economic woes on boomers, especially on the right, by saying that they supported globalization, so on and so forth. But anyway, regardless of whether it comes from the left or the right, the overarching characteristic is that boomers cause some of the problems that we are seeing in the world today, and they should all have a collective responsibility to being blamed for those problems. The second characteristic of anti-boomerism is that they believe that most, if not all, boomers deserve resentment. As in, they supposedly cause the problems, and not only do they deserve blame, but they deserve to be hated, they deserve to be scorned and ridiculed, and they deserve to be an object of political ridicule as a means of supposedly trying to find a way to fix their supposed mess. Another characteristic of anti-boomerism is that boomers do not understand the realities of the world today. This is actually a criticism that more so comes from the left-wing corridors of this position, but the right-wing corridors also have some particular emphasis on it as well, which we'll explore in a second. Another characteristic is that, of course, the right-wing, left-wing phenomenon emphasize different things. On the left, you will see capitalism. You will see a lot of that kind of stuff, or you will see cultural indifference emphasized as the vices of boomers, supposedly. On the right, you're going to see a much more, talk about cultural preservation and tradition being eroded by the boomer generation, and them not being willing to see the rose-colored, the rose-tinted glasses that they have after having grown up in different eras. You will see oftentimes a blame of the post-war consensus on boomers. And you will see oftentimes a blame of a kind of Cold War era mindset that upholds certain ideas and institutions that many people on the right-wing quarters of anti-boomerism see as fundamentally evil and wrong. So that's nothing to look out for. And finally, some elements of anti-boomerism are actually entirely reactive to antagonism that they have received from particular members of the boomer generation. Now, this is actually the case with the famous TikTok phrase, "Okay, boomer." And many of you may remember that from a few years ago. And there was actually a study done to study that famous TikTok phrase. And the study actually went through and it characterized the kind of anti-boomer content that was happening under OK Boomer. And they found several themes in that anti-boomer content. The first theme, and that was actually the overwhelming majority theme of that entire particular sentiment, is that 79% of the TikTok content against boomers that use OK Boomer were based upon negative encounters with baby boomers. 58% was based on conflicting values and conflicting beliefs between baby boomers and young people. 22% was based on the Karen meme, the idea of this lady that constantly wants to talk to your manager, who's constantly causing problems, and the idea is that this lady feels entitled, and that's a relic of the boomer generation, according to them. And another 7% of this sentiment was the wealth gap. So if you want to see left-wing anti-boomerism, TikTok is the place to go, because that is the place where this kind of sentiment is reflected more generally. But back to the right-wing kind of problems they have. So other than homeownership, which is a big problem that many people talk about, and other than that, there's also talk about gender relationships. There's also talk about feminism and hostility towards men that apparently the boomers stoked. There's also talk, again, as I mentioned, the post-war consensus, war, geopolitics, these kind of things that people believe have eroded the West and have made them more susceptible to bad actors. Whereas if the boomers hadn't done anything, or if the boomers had been a little bit more careful in their view, this wouldn't be happening. So there's a few things I want to emphasize here about both approaches. But before we do that, let's actually read some anti-boomer sentiments on the internet that actually have gotten a lot of popularity. So this comes from Jack Posobiec, who is a prominent commentator. He is criticizing the boomer cohort for their reaction to the Canadian election that just passed. He said, for example, boomers' number one issue in the Canadian election was dealing with Donald Trump. Their lowest issues were making housing affordable and making Canada a better place, which feeds the anti-boomer stereotype that boomers are self-absorbed, they do not care about younger generations, and they have passed upon a world to young generations that is bad, and they have no sense of responsibility about it. Connor Tomlinson, who is someone that I've known in the past, and who was also a prominent commentator on the sort of dissident right in the UK, said, for example, that Gen Z is screaming like the Lorax out of the sum of our civilization to tell the boomers that felling every tree in whose shade subsequent generations should sit is a bad idea. He is, of course, responding to the Canadian election as well, blaming boomers for the destruction of civilization. There is another tweet here from this account, Aesthetica, which has gotten over 10,000 likes, that says, I would crash the stock market just so boomers can experience 10% of the pain they have inflicted upon our generation. Another tweet from him says, crashing the economy was totally fine when boomers thought they were going to die from a 99.7% survivable virus that didn't affect young people. Liberal Hive Mind, a popular conservative creator here on YouTube, said, boomers, quote, F the next generation. I want my yacht paid for by endless money printing, speculation and abuse of cheap labor. And he then says, wake up, retards. Candace Owens had a tweet where she basically, a lot of folks interpreted it as her saying that she was waiting for the boomer cohort to pass away. It's just something a little bit more different than that, so that the world would have a different kind of reality to it. There's just so many different tweets. Vagrant of Rhodes said, boomerism as a mindset is civilizational poison. It proposes selling the future to make yourself feel good or superior in the always fleeting now. Not all boomers embody this mentality, but enough do that it's swung our entire culture completely out of balance. So, we have to understand something. No amount of empirical data, no amount of observation is going to be able to address these criticisms. Because the observation and the data that is oftentimes used to support anti-boomer narratives is not actually the source of those narratives, nor are they the foundations of those narratives. They are simply ancillary to the broader point. What actually is going to help here is if I address the foundations of this position. But a few things should be made clear on the empirical side. First of all, it is definitely true that Gen Z is having, and younger generations are having a much harder time buying homes. And it is absolutely true that the biggest cohort, at least in America, of homeowners is people who would be considered to be in the baby boomer cohort. But it should also be understood that when you're in your 70s, and the older of all the baby generations are in their 70s, the youngest is in their 64, their 60s, you have more assets, you have more ability to afford more things, you have greater means to afford more things, therefore, you're going to be able to get more things than your younger generations will. Now, some may counter by saying, well, Christian, when they were 25, they actually already owed homes. Yeah, but look at the world they existed in. A world where bread was only a few cents, a world where gas was only a dollar or so, a world before stagflation. The oldest of the boomers actually reached maturity before stagflation in the 70s. A world where the dollar went a lot further than it did now. You can't look at the merits of a particular generation's youth and attempt to copy and paste them upon the current world without actually considering the world they live in. And that's actually going to be one of the more fundamental points I make here in a second when it comes to generational understanding. But the first thing I think was really important, beyond the empirical stuff, is understanding that anti-boomerism, as I mentioned in my intro, is merely resentment, but not merely resentment, is also imprudent. Generational guilt is imprudent. It's imprudent for several reasons. Number one, because it rests off of a generalization. It is almost impossible for anyone to logically assign blame to groups or to abstractions because groups or abstractions do not have minds. Groups or abstractions do not have wills. Groups and abstractions do not act. People act. Individuals act. So you must treat people, if not as individuals, treat them as concrete people, even if they exist in social context, and proceed upon that point. When you do that, you can actually establish blame. Blame cannot be assigned to ideas or to notions. Blame must be assigned to people. And the fundamental flaw of the anti-boomer narrative that makes it such a dead end is that it takes the concern of people out of the equation and makes this an abstract issue, an issue triggered by the imaginations and triggered by passion, one that leaves us nowhere to go except to continue to speak of these issues on a grand level and not actually understand them at their root. And this is actually a very important thing to consider. When we talk about people, we can then talk about the environments they were raised in and the environments they existed in that may influence their perceptions and that also may influence how they lived and how they view the world right now. Because one of the core complaints of the OK Boomer cohort of the Anti-Boomer Coalition is that boomers don't understand young people. You have to understand that all of us, every generation, exists within an ocean. And the ocean we swim in defines how we grow up and defines largely our worldviews. And retrospect and hindsight comes afterwards. Every generation existed within waters that they swam, and they did not consider anything beyond that. A fish, for example, does not consider the fact that it is a fish. A fish that lives within the Marianas Trench does not consider the fact that it lives in the deepest point in the earth. It simply sees its environment and it reacts to its environment. Now, when you are far removed from something, it's much easier to critically evaluate the merits and the flaws of that particular environment that you went away from, right? So if I lived in a small town and I go to a bigger town, but then I go back to my small town 10 years later, I'm going to find some things that I didn't understand previously. This is hindsight. But the hindsight of time is not the same thing as the hindsight of place. I just described you the hindsight of place, me leaving a place then going back to a different place. That's very different because that can happen anytime. But the hindsight of time cannot happen because we are all fixed to the current year or the current decade that we're currently in, and we cannot manipulate that. We can only exist within it. What is happening right now is that a lot of critics of boomers are not considering the times they were raised in, the place they were raised in, or in other words, the waters they swam in. They're not considering that the fish does not know it's swimming in the Marianas Trench. The fish only knows its environment, and the fish only knows what it is endowed with. Now, people are obviously higher animals than fish. We can think, we can reason, we can build civilizations, but still, people are still consumed by their environment because man is inherently a social animal. So there is limitations to retrospect if it exists in the abstract. It doesn't actually consider concrete people. And I think that this also leads into another problem, that anti-boomerism fundamentally misunderstands the relationship between responsibility and generational outcomes. So as I mentioned, if we cannot assign blame or guilt to groups, but only blame or guilt to people, then we have to ask ourselves, okay, who were the people that were behind a lot of the so-called problems that the boomers supposedly created? And you'll find that if it's true that the youngest of the boomers were 18 and 82, you'll find that a lot of the complaints people have about the housing market, about the post-war consensus, so on and so forth, were actually done by the generation that preceded the boomers. And they themselves inherited that, and they themselves swam in those waters. The Cold War was not started by boomers, because when the Cold War began, boomers were like literally not in existence. And when they were in existence, they were like infants and toddlers. Right? Economic crises and the sort of unwise economic policies that moved within the mid-20th century, the adoption of Keynesianism, stagflation, all these things that eventually did lead to the housing crisis. Of course, there are other things that led to it as well, that paved the way for that kind of policy, the kind of unsound policy that led to the housing crisis, that paved the way. That stuff was also not done by boomers either, because they were not in power at that time, so on and so forth. So when we actually understand this, we can understand, hey, maybe it's unwise to assume that people who inherited something inherently had a role in creating that particular something. If we don't assume that, then we begin assigning blame where it's not due. But also, anti-boomerism assumes a certain viewpoint about power and responsibility that is also fundamentally erroneous. It assumes what I call the power worldview, that society is organized from on high by groups of people that possess power and can arrange society as if it's a bunch of chess pieces on a board. But in all reality, societies are not organized from on high. Societies are organized, as the great thinkers of the Scottish Enlightenment told us, as Adam Ferguson and Adam Smith. It is organized and generated by the spontaneous actions of the people that exist within it. Every single action builds up into creating a grand social stratosphere. In fact, Adam Ferguson himself was actually quite clear about this. James Mackintosh, another thinker of the Scottish Enlightenment, was actually quite clear that even when it comes to politics, political institutions are not created through architects. They instead arise from the conditions and the realities that exist within a particular generation's time. But the moment we abstract that and we completely treat the events of their time as insignificant to what actually arose from those times, is the moment we walk within error. So in other words, boomers did not, or anyone, even the greatest generation, who were indeed responsible for a lot of the policies that made people hit on boomers, they did not act on society. Rather, they did not act on society in a vacuum. Society also acted against, right? For every war that was happening, there was protests. For every economic unsound policy that was happening, there were columns and articles written by economists who were urging sound money and urging sound practices. Societies are not this sort of thing, this sort of board that is acted upon unilaterally. They are forces of nature. They are phenomena themselves that arise from human dynamism and the application of our creative potentials towards our advancement as a species. So anti-boomerism, however, presumes a very narrow and linear view of society that is not only incorrect, but it cheapens the role that free will plays in shaping how things actually are. The act of labeling something boomer, or labeling a particular thing or accomplishment as boomer, is a category error and a confusion of terms as well. Because I mentioned, generations do not act as a hive mind. People within generations act. For every boomer who partook in feminism or partook in the Vietnam War protests, there were an equal amount of boomers, people like Phyllis Schlafly, so on and so forth, that had a very different valence to what they believed, that in some cases actually fundamentally rejected feminism and tried to push a very sort of traditionalistic view upon the world. Again, you can't view these things as singular and linear. You have to view these things as a bunch of forces. Think of Newton, a bunch of forces acting on each other and eventually creating outcomes that ultimately cannot be predicted, but are felt by successive generations. Anti-Boomerism is built upon a caricature rather than an actual evaluation of the facts. Another thing I think is very important to mention about anti-Boomerism is that it harms fidelity. In a society, any society, being able to trust others to do as they say, being able to trust others to behave in a certain way, and being able to be loyal to the not just the principles of your society, but also loyal to the distinctive character of your society that makes it what it is, and without which it cannot exist, is absolutely essential. In the moment fidelity goes away, is the moment horrific behaviors can become justified by virtue of either resentment or by anger or something of that sort. It's the moment where we can no longer respect certain things like children, or respect certain things like tombstones or gravestones as sites of the dead that should be respected and not just defiled or destroyed. Respect certain things like privacy, so on and so forth. Fidelity is the thing that keeps together every functioning society. But when there is a sense of hatred of people on the basis of what group they belong to, as opposed to being a sense of understanding of particular facts and circumstances, fidelity goes the way of the dodo bird. Fidelity can easily be wiped away and overtaken by the violent passions, the vicious passions that are fundamentally anti-social. So, in summation, my friends, anti-Boomerism is incorrect because it assumes that society is acted upon as opposed to acting upon things that happen to it. It assumes that you can assign collective guilt to a group of people on the basis of things that they inherited, rather than actually having a nuanced understanding of the world they inherited. It assumes as well that all generational outcomes are the fault and can be linked to be responsible to previous generations, as opposed to being the result of things that arose spontaneously. And most importantly, it also destroys fidelity. My friends, it is not going to be fruitful for anyone to criticize generational cohorts. I can't criticize Generation Alpha for the almost certainly maladaptive psychological behaviors they're going to have when they grow up, because they're being raised on Skibbity Toilet and they're being raised on TikTok. If you don't know what the former is, don't look it up if you value your sanity. I can't judge them for that. I can look at the environment they were in and then say, okay, this is why they are acting this way. This is why the impulse control is off. This is why they're not reasoning as well. This is why they tortured the attention span as well, because of the waters they swam in. And I can't blame Gen Z for that. I can't blame the Gen Xers for that. I can't blame the millennials for that, because they wanted to help progress the world by creating the cell phone or creating the digital interconnected world. I can't blame people for negative things that happen due to effects that arise spontaneously. All I can do is do what every other generation throughout human history has done, and try to reckon with the world as it is, not as I wish it was. And then also try to gradually improve the condition of humanity by fostering virtue, by being innovative, by being creative, by having goodwill and having charity, and not having hatred and viciousness and resentment within me. But anti-Boomerism actually tips the scales back on human progress by promoting passion, promoting collective guilt, promoting viciousness, over promoting goodwill, charity, fidelity, and everything else that is needed to keep society moving forward. It is a dead end. I believe that the best way for any generation to learn from each other is by recognizing the similarities and where those similarities show up within future generations, and trying to go back to those generational strands and understand why things are how they are. This is the best way. Understanding, not being snobbish, not being resentful, not being indifferent, but understanding the concepts that form the modern world. That is how every generation can progress. There are indeed some people that belong to the boomer cohort who are, looked down upon younger people. But there are also young people that look down upon the boomer cohort. This is really actually normal. Every generation, there's a song from the group called Mike and the Mechanics. And I'm not going to sing it, but it's called Living Years. It's called Every Generation Blames the One Before, and all of their frustrations come banging on the door. And it's basically talking about the regret that the people singing the song have because they blamed their fathers and their mothers and their families for all the problems of the world and didn't actually try to understand how they grew up. Regret is probably the biggest flaw of anti-boomerism. Because if you spend your days constructing an image of people within your mind that is hateful and that is not charitable, and eventually there comes a time where those people are no longer around and problems persist and new problems arise, it is very likely that regret will seep in because you will realize that the source of your problems, even though they're gone, the problems linger and persist and new problems arise, and there could be a similar kind of resentment directed towards you. Resentment breeds resentment, and a lack of charity breeds lack of charity. These things are definitely passed down through generations. So in closing, my friends, we ought to reject anti-boomerism. We ought to reject attempting to pen certain empirical realities upon a particular generation. We ought to have an objective evaluation of intergenerational relationships. And most importantly, my friends, we ought to have a kind of charity towards people, regardless of their age, regardless of their standing in society, a charity that helps us understand where they succeeded and avoid the pitfalls they fell in as they were trying to grow up. If we do this, my friends, I think the intergenerational dialogue will be much better. And not only that, but I believe Western civilization will get much stronger for it, and there will be a much more rational approach to the problems of the day. My friends, like, share, comment, subscribe. Do whatever you can to ensure our channel is successful. My friends, study history, study philosophy. Remember, we can please stay pensive. Bye, guys.